Hi, my name's Andy Schmuckler. I've had my own personal reasons for noting that while um, there used to be major perspectives on the human world being offered about how it works, um, when I was growing up and being educated, um, Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud both had well-established schools of thought in our world, uh, and they've lost stature for good reasons too. Um, but what I noticed is that there is nothing comparable to that's out there. There's um, no perspective on the human world that's presented as showing some big piece of the order of things, claiming to show probably more than it did. But and in any event, that was something that an earlier era that I lived in seemed to have energy for, and those two guys have sort of receded considerably from dominating any big chunks of thought in our civilization. And there's nothing else that is actually playing that role. And so I ask myself, how are we to understand a change of that sort? Why? Oh, and then looking back on the field in which I've been operating, because I came upon all this because I was in the business of presenting an ordering perspective. That's what brought me to look around and see, well, what is occupying that kind of a niche in our cultural consciousness? And the answer is nothing. So why would that be? What does it mean? And I kind of think that it's not it's a profound dimension of consciousness. If in my field, if you go back to say the late 19th and early 20th centuries, my field meaning people thinking about what are the forces and the processes at work in the human world. There was a lot of energy for creating big social theories. The Russians, the Germans, Durkheim, Freud. There were big theories out there, and it just seemed that people had a sense that what's been happening, what is in the human world, is something that we can get a good picture of, and they did things like outline stages that things went through. It didn't always hold up, but you can tell that. And my grandfather's bookshelf was full of these Russian thinkers about, I forget, Bolkarov. Not doing well with names, but anyway, it was a big thing, and it was people were apparently looking for some way of perceiving, the history that people knew, and the stuff that's happening in the world around them, and coming up with ways of understanding the order of things. Like if Max Weber writes The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, showing that the change in religious beliefs went along with the rise of a new kind of dynamic capitalism that accumulated wealth and grew so that Europe ended up being able to colonize the world, all that kind of stuff. Those are ordering things. And there isn't anything occupying that now. It isn't in in the spirit of our times, the zeitgeist, as the Germans would put it, to be thinking about how it all fits together. Now, why would that be? No, I think about institutionally. Um, there's this, you know, there was big sociology 100 and some years ago, and then gradually more and more specialization in every field that has to do with the human world. No more people trying to bestride a newly emergent field, but things getting more and more broken up into pieces. And I think that that's an important part of it. But I think there's a spiritual aspect to it also. The the spiritual perception of things has to do with the order of things or the disorder of things. But if you're in a real mundane frame of mind where you're not really looking how each thing in your life is sort of consecrated and connected with the, you know, the holy or whatever. Holy being connected with the word for whole, meaning that there is more than just bits and pieces, every one damn thing after another. So I've been, my life's work basically is to get out there something I've developed, which is, I think, a useful way of ordering a meaningful chunk of our situation as human beings and as Americans. And I am struck that I don't have what the kind of following that I would be seeking. But at the same time, nobody is coming and saying, here's the flaw. So I feel that I'm trying to sell something into a market where the demand isn't there. If the demand were there, somebody else would, at least somebody would be occupying the kind of niche that Freud and Marx occupied in the middle of the 20th century. But unless I've missed something, there's nothing as much of a contender. I mean, there have been some kinds of ideas like Edmund Wilson back in the 70s, sociobiology, which had its points and its defects and basically didn't really transform anything. The way I claim that this thing I've developed should. So why isn't there a market? Maybe people think that there isn't any order. That's one thing I've wondered about, that people, and that makes me think that there's, that it is a sort of a spiritual fault of the times, that we're not really plugged into the sacred, where the people finding things sacred sort of plugs into some kind of really powerful pool of spiritual feeling. It's a reality that people do experience that sometimes. And our society has been kind of lacking a sense of the spiritual dimension of things, and therefore not really being inclined to look for the wholeness one route to which is a good intellectual understanding of the structure of our world and how the systemic dynamics operate to explain the course that we took, which is what I claim, that any creature, that the step out of the niche in which we evolved biologically had necessary, inevitable consequences that explain a whole lot. In a nutshell, that's the thing. And I think, to my mind, I kind of mathematically make that conclusion irresistible. But so I want people to go check it out, because nobody's come back and even when it came out and made a bit of a splash and got a lot of reviews. So maybe people don't go to check it out because they really assume that there's nothing value there. Maybe the attempts of Freud and Marx and the others of that, late 19th, early 20th century gang of social thinkers, maybe their failure to shed a whole lot of light on the things that we've tried to understand since. Maybe that's discredited the whole idea of there being some underlying order that can be discerned and illuminating some major chunk of the human story. So I think that one of the things which has happened because of the rise of fascism now is that disconnect with the spiritual world that would make one hunger for good ways of understanding things more integratedly. That there isn't the craving for that. Maybe just believing that reality just consists of the various pieces. Maybe it's part of the ramification of the scientific worldview, where there's not any connective tissue, in a sense, in the human world that's recognized. That means that the human story is not really just one damn thing after another. Seeing things in pieces is a loss of a significant nature, to the extent to which there actually are wholes. And I think I can show that there are wholes. Wholes in the sense of causes and effects weaving to show that there are forces at work, that we can see the way you can see the wind in the blowing, the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line, that there are actually ways of looking at, as a social scientist, at the web of connections and the network of causes and effects that shows that the step that our species took unleashes a certain kind of destructive force. It has huge ramifications for understanding, first of all, what kind of creatures we are. And I say I can prove that we're better creatures than we have imagined, because the ugliness we see in human history isn't a clear picture of human nature. Any creature, regardless of their inherent nature, if they stepped out of their biologically evolved niche onto the path of civilization, the inevitable consequence will be that the civilization will develop in certain directions. The systemic dynamic that this new breakthrough creates makes it inevitable that that's where the direction of things will go. And when you look at that, then you realize we've not really seen ourselves all that well. and we're entitled to see ourselves as better creatures than we have been taught. It also affects our understanding of what the forces are at work that have made human history the way it's been. And then once we see those forces, then we'll be better able to address getting those forces under control. It is conceivable that we wouldn't have to have a civilization in which so much is as broken as you can see it has been for thousands of years. But you have to bring those forces under control. And it would help to be able to see the forces. They can be shown. My website is abetterhumanstory.org. I'm offering something to play the role of illuminating lens that Freud and Marx played for lots of people more than half a century ago, or offering it because I actually think it could have a beneficial impact. As I see it, the chances of of human civilization surviving for the long haul on this planet are 50-50. I think there's a good chance we're going to destroy ourselves. And how well we understand what we're up against, that's the title of that book, What We're Up Against, will have a lot to do with how effectively we're able to combat it and see that the life-serving forces can triumph over the destructive forces. And of course, one of the big battles in that whole millennia-long battle, a series of battles, is this upcoming presidential election. What we see on one side and what we see on the other can be traced to different coherent forces that have evolved through our historical process to have a showdown. Not the only battle, but certainly a big showdown about whether we're going to be a democracy or whether we're going to be a fascist dictatorship. I'm optimistic, but it is alarming and somewhat mind-blowing that we in America could be in a situation where the outcome was even in doubt. It really shows that in America, this battle between different forces should have gone a lot differently. The forces that needed to be protecting against the destructive force that's now threatening to turn us into a fascist dictatorship needed to see what it was up against. That's what happens when you see things whole. This thing that is threatening to turn us into a fascist dictatorship, it's not just one man. It is a whole set of forces that have been coming together for since the end of the first Bush administration. It could have been defeated easier, earlier. So there's a fair amount of blame to go around. And part of the problem with the democracy defending forces is that they weren't looking for the larger underlying order. Look at all the things the Republican Party is doing, and isn't it remarkably how consistently it's making things worse? Draw an inference that there is a coherent force behind it. That liberal America failed to do. And I've talked a lot about my history with that back in the 90s and the 2000s. But now it is awakened. The Kamala Harris campaign is a spiritual movement that is its power is inseparable from the fact that it is plugged into the deeper orders of, I would say, good and evil. The joy, the passion, the hope and the brightness in the message, and the contrast with the other side. A vision for a better future versus American carnage, and we're a garbage can. Light versus darkness, it really is. And we could see this darkness rising. If you look for the underlying order, there's a coherent force. Oh, and you can trace this coherent force back through American history and through the whole history of civilization, because this whole pattern of brokenness has been transmitted from one form to another as moving through time. How the brokenness of war creates the brokenness of trauma and injustice, and so on. There is an underlying order. In fact, there are several underlying orders. There is the one, the order of life that produced us, and that we're still inseparable from, because, for example, if we ruin the Earth's climate badly enough, we'll bring our own human experiment to an end. Biologically evolved order. And then there's the difficulties that we have been unleashed on the world, because we became the first creatures on this planet to break out of the biologically evolved order and break into, inevitably, a disorder, and a disorder that generates a force in the form of a selective process. The disorder is a war of all against all. That's inevitable. Once any species on any planet they're going to get involved in a war of all against all. And out of that system of a war of all against all, basically anarchy, it is inevitable that only what can prevail in a war of all against all will survive and spread from among all the cultural options. In other words, the creature comes out, it breaks through into civilization that has a whole lot bigger range of where it can take culture. And you look at it and you say, oh, the creature is free. It's free to create its own cultures. Yeah, but then it turns out that in a world where there's going to be where the strong can do what they will do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. In that world, there's going to be a selective process. Yeah, theoretically, the creature is free to create all kinds of cultures, but only the kinds of cultures that are conducive to surviving in a war of all against all. And that tends to be actually some pretty ugly stuff that does well in that world. And you can see it in the ugliness of all the empires that arose whenever civilization arose. There's a selective process going on that's inevitable, because there's no order like there was throughout the evolution of life up until that point, to make sure that the interactions of the elements are in some service of the larger order. That's what happens in the biological order. You get predators and prey whose interactions are within an ecologically viable system that can survive into the future. It tends to build synergistic interactions, even between things which appear on the surface to be contrary interests, which are also there, because evolution, though it does create order, is not at all purposeful or planned. So there will be predators, and there will be parasites, and there will be suffering. But the system tends to perpetuate itself until some creature breaks out of it, and all of a sudden there are all these different possibilities. And out of those possibilities, only certain kinds will survive and spread. And so the civilization inevitably, because of this selective process, will evolve in the direction of power maximization, where power is defined in ways which have to do with the ability of a civilization to survive a war of all against all. A selection for the ways of power, where power, in the terms of being able to survive that thing, that kind of power, is a function of all kinds of things. I mean, almost every dimension of a society, its technology, its economic organization, the psychological structure and motivational system of its, the culture instills in its residents, the political system and its effectiveness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things will bear upon who survives in this war of all against all that could not be avoided, because there was no order waiting for this breakthrough. I mean, life evolved on this planet for 3.5 billion years, and there was never anything like what's happened in the last 10 or 12,000 years of human history. There was never anything like a creature extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. And that's my definition of civilization, by the way. And once you start on that trail, a whole lot is inevitable. And I think I can prove it. So we have an election coming up. The latest manifestation of a force of brokenness that human beings have inevitably had to contend with is we've got this fascist force that's gained so much power in America, somehow because of the sleeping of the other part of America, has gained so much power that we are approaching an election in which, though I'm optimistic, I have to realistically say there is a genuine possibility that fascism will win this election. I have worried about it profoundly. Sometimes I'm less worried about it than I've been for a good while. But I really know that I don't know. We have lived in an age of surprises, and one of my recent past videos is about how we do not understand all the forces that are at work in America today. All of us who can't believe that almost half of our country would even contemplate voting for this guy after everybody we've seen. It shows us that we really don't understand what all's going on. So I don't really feel like we're in a position to know what the dynamics are going to look like when we look back and see what mattered and what didn't matter, what caught on, what moved people, what didn't move people, what people were choosing. The world is I promised you guys that if you go to abetterhumanstory.org, you'll see something that illuminates something. But here I keep on coming back to the thing that I can't illuminate to my satisfaction, which is how do you get good and intelligent people to follow what is so blatantly the opposite of good, and whose pronouncements are so obviously something that an intelligent person wouldn't believe. It remains a mystery to me. I'm kind of despairing that I'll ever really understand how that could happen. But I've seen it. I've had a ringside seat to see it. I did talk radio out here in the Shenandoah Valley, talking with conservatives back in the 90s, had a wonderful time with them. There was a beauty to be had there. And now I live among the same people who are about to go out to the polls and vote for Donald Trump. Completely contrary to every beautiful value that they expressed back in the 1990s. And I don't understand how. I mean, I've got things to say about it, which you can find on my videos, but there's something fundamentally mysterious about what all has happened in America to make this possible. And I'm a praying person, but I'm sure I will be praying some between now and when the election's called. It's sort of like people not being atheists in a foxhole. We're under considerable attack from a very dangerous force that intends us no good. We are in a foxhole, and I'll probably, like the the proverbial atheist in the foxhole be sending up some prayers saying, God help us to serve an American democracy to survive and to have this Trumpian destructive force that's the latest incarnation of what civilization has been plagued with, that will send it into oblivion, that will defeat it so bad that it can never raise its head again. I have had hopes for that kind of a thing. I haven't completely given up hope for, actually some kind of a landslide. I don't think the landslide that I used to hope for is possible, like a 60-40, like beyond Alf Landon in 36 and McGovern in 72 and other landslides. I don't think that's not possible. But I do think that there is a possibility from a lot of the things that I've read that are rather subtle windows into things, like how many Republicans does it turn out are voting actually for Harris, so that the number of registered Republicans versus the number of registered Democrats in the early vote doesn't mean necessarily votes for Trump by the Republicans, not necessarily, because it seems like there's a significant chunk. I mean, that's what I read. So I can imagine still, if not a huge landslide, I can imagine a decisive bludgeoning. I don't know if I can imagine Florida or Texas going blue. I guess that's not in the cards, but winning by a bigger margin even than Biden won in 2020. I can imagine that, but I'll settle for any victory. Okay, we're up against a force that could have been seen earlier and defeated earlier. Therefore, it is important to be able to see the big pieces and how they operate. And one would have seen that the Republican Party was getting taken over by something that was multidimensional and coherent and destructive. It was visible. But you got to be looking for the underlying order. And here I am still hawking my wares about, hey, guys, I got this underlying order and it actually holds water. I'm not saying it explains everything, but it explains some things in an important way. And what if there's nobody out there that even would want to go see it, even if it were true? Anyway, I keep trying. Take a look, abetterhumanstory.org. It discerns a multidimensional order that I think is substantially valid and that makes some important things clear that are different from the way we look at them now, which could help us survive on this planet for the long haul. Instead of destroying ourselves through a nuclear holocaust or environmental catastrophe, which are real possibilities.